Sarah Connor was 29 years old and starting fresh after a devastating divorce when she bought the Victorian house in Portland, Oregon, but she had no idea that within 72 hours she would discover a secret that would shatter everything she believed about her identity and force her to question whether her entire life had been an elaborate lie constructed by people she trusted most. The house itself seemed ordinary enough, built in 1897 with original hardwood floors and ornate molding that spoke of better days, but it was the third-floor bedroom that would change everything. Sarah was stripping layers of floral wallpaper that had been painted over multiple times when her scraper hit something unusual behind the wall. What she found taped carefully to the bare plaster was more than just an old photograph. It was a window into a past that officially never existed, a family portrait from 1973 showing 5 people who looked hauntingly familiar, especially the youngest child, a girl who could have been Sarah's twin sister, but that was impossible because Sarah wasn't even born until 1994. The photograph was professional quality, black and white with the kind of formal posing typical of family portraits from that era, but there were subtle details that seemed wrong. The father's smile didn't reach his eyes, the mother's hands were clenched tightly at her sides, and all 3 children had the same hollow expression that Sarah would later recognize as the look of people living in constant fear. But the most disturbing detail was written on the back in faded blue ink: Connor family, September 1973, followed by what looked like coordinates or perhaps an address that had been partially erased, as if someone had tried to remove all traces of where these people had once lived. Sarah spent that first night staring at the photograph under her desk lamp, comparing it to her own childhood pictures. The resemblance between herself and the little girl was so exact that she began to wonder if somehow this was actually her in the photograph, but that would mean she was 58 years old, not 29, which was obviously impossible, yet the evidence of her eyes suggested something far stranger than she was prepared to accept. The next morning Sarah decided to call her mother, Margaret Connor, who had raised her alone after Sarah's father died when she was supposedly 3 years old. But when Sarah described the photograph, she heard something in her mother's voice that she had never heard before. Raw terror barely contained panic, and then an abrupt command to never mention the photograph to anyone ever again. "Mom, what aren't you telling me?" Sarah pressed, but Margaret had already hung up the phone, leaving Sarah more confused and frightened than before because her mother had never kept secrets from her. They had always been close, sharing everything, but now Margaret was acting like Sarah had stumbled onto something dangerous, something that could destroy their family. Unable to let it go, Sarah drove to the Portland Historical Society, where she met Dorothy Mills, a volunteer archivist who specialized in local genealogy. Dorothy examined the photograph carefully, then spent 3 hours searching through records from the 1970s, but what she found was deeply disturbing. There was absolutely no trace of any Connor family matching this description living in Portland during that time period. "It's as if they were erased from history," Dorothy said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I've been doing this work for 30 years and I've never seen anything like it. Usually when records are missing it's because of a fire or water damage, but these records weren't destroyed, they were surgically removed by someone who knew exactly what they were looking for." Sarah asked Dorothy what that could mean, and the older woman's response sent chills down her spine. "In my experience, this kind of systematic record removal only happens when law enforcement or federal agencies are involved, usually witness protection or something even more serious." But Dorothy warned that if Sarah kept digging she might be putting herself in danger. Against Dorothy's advice, Sarah hired Michael Torres, a former Portland police detective turned private investigator who specialized in cold cases and missing persons. Michael had contacts in law enforcement and access to databases that weren't available to the public, but when he ran the Connor family through his systems, the results were more disturbing than anyone expected. "The family definitely existed," Michael told Sarah during their meeting at a downtown coffee shop, "but they're not listed as Connor, they're listed as Henderson, and according to official records they all died in a house fire on September 20, 1973, just 5 days after this photograph was taken." Sarah felt the room spinning around her as Michael continued his report, but here where it gets really strange. The fire report was classified by the FBI, which is unusual for a simple house fire, and there were no bodies recovered, which the report explains by saying the fire burned so hot that it completely cremated the remains, but fire investigators I spoke to say that's basically impossible. Michael showed Sarah copies of newspaper clippings from September 1973 that told a different story than the official reports. Neighbors reported hearing gunshots before the fire started. Police found evidence of forced entry and accelerant throughout the house, and at least 3 witnesses saw men in dark suits removing boxes of documents from the property before the fire department even arrived. But the most chilling detail was buried in a single paragraph of the fire marshal report. The investigation was terminated by federal order within 24 hours, and all evidence was transferred to an unnamed government agency that claimed jurisdiction under national security provisions, which meant someone very powerful wanted the Henderson family to disappear permanently. Sarah realized she was dealing with something far more dangerous than a simple case of mistaken identity, but she was also starting to understand that her entire life might be built on lies constructed by people who had reasons to hide the truth about what really happened to the Henderson family in September 1973. Michael warned Sarah that continuing the investigation could put her in serious danger, but he also gave her a lead. Arthur Brennan, the photographer who had taken the family portrait, was still alive and living in Portland, and according to Michael, the old man had been asking questions about the Henderson family for decades, as if he knew something that others wanted to keep buried. Sarah met Arthur at his cluttered studio apartment filled with decades worth of camera equipment and thousands of photographs, but when she showed him the family portrait, his reaction was immediate and terrifying. He locked the door, turned off all the lights, and whispered that they had found him after 50 years of hiding. Arthur told Sarah that he had never forgotten the Henderson family because they had come to his studio under such strange circumstances. The father, David Henderson, had been nervous and kept checking his watch as if he knew they were running out of time. The mother, Margaret, had been crying throughout the entire photo session, and the children had been unusually quiet and well behaved, as if they had been coached. But what Arthur remembered most clearly was what happened after the family left his studio. He developed the photographs that same evening as requested and prepared 5 copies for the family, but before he could deliver them, 2 men in federal agent suits arrived at his studio demanding all negatives and prints related to the Henderson family. The men claimed to be from the Department of Social Services and showed Arthur official-looking identification that he later realized was probably fake. They told him the family was in witness protection and that any photographs could compromise their safety, but Arthur had already made 1 extra print which he hid in his darkroom just in case something happened to the family. Arthur pulled out a manila envelope that had been sealed for 50 years. Inside was an identical copy of the photograph Sarah had found, plus something even more shocking, a second photograph taken just moments after the first one that showed the same family but with expressions of absolute terror, as if someone had threatened them between shots. The second photograph revealed details that had been cropped out of the first version, including a man in a dark suit standing just outside the camera frame and what appeared to be the barrel of a gun pointing at David Henderson's head, which explained why the father looked so terrified in the formal family portrait. Arthur told Sarah that he had spent 50 years wondering what happened to the Henderson family and why federal agents had confiscated evidence from what was supposedly just a house fire. He had made discreet inquiries over the decades and discovered a pattern of similar cases, families who disappeared after the father discovered something he shouldn't have known. But Arthur also revealed something that made Sarah's blood run cold. He had recognized Margaret Henderson's face from recent photographs in the Portland newspaper Society pages. She was now calling herself Margaret Connor and had been photographed at charity events and community functions as a respected member of Portland social circles, which meant Sarah's mother had been living under a false identity for 50 years. Sarah confronted her mother that evening with Arthur photographs and demanded the truth. Margaret broke down completely and confessed that everything Sarah knew about their family history was a carefully constructed lie designed to protect them both from people who had murdered David Henderson and destroyed their original family. The truth was more complex and terrifying than Sarah had imagined. Margaret Henderson had been married to David Henderson in the early 1970s, and they had 3 children, Sarah, Michael, and Jennifer. David worked as an accountant for what appeared to be a legitimate business but in reality was a front for a massive money laundering operation run by organized crime figures with connections to corrupt politicians and law enforcement officials. When David discovered the true nature of his employer's business, he made the fatal mistake of trying to collect evidence that he could use to negotiate immunity with federal prosecutors, but the criminal organization had infiltrators and law enforcement who warned them about David's plan, and they decided to eliminate the entire Henderson family to prevent any possibility of exposure. On September 15, 1973, just 5 days before the attack, David had insisted on taking a family portrait because he somehow knew they were in danger. He told Margaret it might be the last photograph they would ever take together, and his prediction proved tragically accurate. The attack on the Henderson house came just before dawn on September 20, 1973. Armed men broke in through multiple entry points. David Henderson was killed immediately with a single gunshot to the head. Margaret was severely wounded but survived by pretending to be dead, and the 3 children were taken alive for reasons that would only become clear decades later. Margaret managed to escape before the men set the house on fire, but she was too injured to pursue the kidnappers, and when police and firefighters arrived they were told that federal agents had already taken jurisdiction over the case, which meant local law enforcement was blocked from conducting a real investigation. During the months Margaret spent recovering and hiding, she learned from underground contacts that her children had been sold to an illegal adoption network that specialized in providing untraceable children to wealthy families who couldn't adopt through legal channels. The children were given new identities, new birth dates, and new histories that completely erased their connection to the Henderson family. But Margaret never stopped searching for her children. She spent decades following leads, working with private investigators and building relationships with people who operated in the gray areas between legal and illegal adoption services, and slowly, over the course of 20 years, she managed to track down all 3 of her children. Michael had been renamed Jason Morrison and adopted by a wealthy family in San Francisco who told him his parents had died in a car accident. He became a successful lawyer but suffered from recurring nightmares about a house fire and faceless men in suits who chased him through burning rooms. Jennifer had been renamed Amanda Chen and placed with a family in Houston who claimed she was an orphan from Vietnam. They told her she had been traumatized during the war, which explained her memory gaps, but Amanda became a teacher who was haunted by dreams of siblings she couldn't remember and a mother who sang lullabies in English, not Vietnamese. And Sarah, the youngest, had been renamed multiple times as she was passed between different families who couldn't handle her trauma-induced behavioral problems. She finally ended up in foster care as a teenager with no memory of her life before the age of 7 and no understanding of why she sometimes woke up screaming about men with guns. Margaret realized that trauma had protected her children by erasing their memories of the attack, but it also meant they had no recollection of their real family or the danger they might still face from the people who had destroyed their original lives. So Margaret made a desperate decision to reclaim at least one of her children. Using forged documents and a carefully constructed false identity, Margaret Connor became a widow interested in adopting an older foster child. She manipulated the system to gain custody of Sarah, who had no idea she was being reunited with her real mother and who accepted the story that she had been born in 1994 instead of 1966. But Margaret's plan was more complex than simple reunion. She had discovered that the criminal organization responsible for murdering her husband was still active and still powerful, which meant revealing the truth about the Henderson family could put all of them in danger. So she decided to wait until she could find a way to bring down the entire network. Over the years, Margaret had collected evidence about the money laundering operation, the corrupt officials who had covered up the murder, and the illegal adoption network that had trafficked her children. She had been building a case that could finally bring justice for David's death, but she needed her children to remember their past in order to testify about what they had witnessed. Sarah's integration into Margaret's new life had been carefully orchestrated to gradually awaken her suppressed memories through familiar environments, subtle reminders, and eventually the revelation of the hidden family photograph that Margaret had planted in the house, knowing that Sarah's renovation project would uncover it. But Margaret hadn't anticipated how quickly Sarah would begin investigating on her own, or how dangerous it would become once she started asking questions about the Henderson family, because the criminal organization still had people monitoring for any inquiries related to their past operations. Michael Torres, the private investigator Sarah had hired, was actually working for federal agents who had been investigating the same criminal network for decades. They had been waiting for someone connected to the Henderson case to surface so they could finally build a prosecution case against the surviving members of the organization. When Sarah began her investigation, it triggered alerts in multiple federal databases, and within 48 hours she was under surveillance by both law enforcement officers trying to protect her and criminal operatives trying to determine how much she knew about their past operations. The situation became critical when Arthur Brennan, the photographer, was found dead in his studio apartment just 3 days after meeting with Sarah. The official cause of death was listed as natural causes, but federal investigators found evidence that he had been murdered to prevent him from revealing more information about the Henderson family. Sarah received a phone call at 2 in the morning from someone claiming to be Arthur's grandson, who warned her that men in dark suits had been asking questions about her and that she needed to disappear immediately because the same people who had killed the Henderson family 50 years ago were now targeting anyone who knew about the case. But instead of running, Sarah decided to fight back with help from Michael Torres, who revealed his true identity as a federal agent, and Margaret, who finally shared all the evidence she had been collecting for decades. They developed a plan to expose the entire criminal network and bring justice for David Henderson murder. The plan involved using Sarah as bait to draw out the remaining members of the organization while federal agents monitored her every move, but it also required Sarah to reconnect with her siblings, who would need to testify about their memories of the night their family was destroyed. Contacting Jason Morrison in San Francisco proved challenging because he had built a successful law career and was reluctant to jeopardize it by getting involved in what sounded like a conspiracy theory. But when federal agents showed him evidence of his real identity and the circumstances of his adoption, he agreed to cooperate with the investigation. Amanda Chin in Houston was initially skeptical, but she had always felt like her adoptive parents were hiding something from her, and when DNA tests confirmed that she was Jennifer Henderson, she began to recover suppressed memories of the night her family was attacked. The three siblings worked with therapists and hypnotists to recover their childhood memories, and gradually they began to remember details about their father work, the strange men who had visited their house, and the conversations they had overheard about money and dangerous people. But recovering their memories also made them targets, because the criminal organization had informants and law enforcement who reported that the Henderson children were alive and cooperating with federal investigators, which meant the survivors of the original conspiracy decided to eliminate them before they could testify. The first attempt came when Jason Morrison office building in San Francisco was evacuated due to a bomb threat that turned out to be a diversion while armed men searched his law firm for evidence related to the Henderson case, but federal agents had anticipated the move and were waiting for them. Amanda Chin's school in Houston was also targeted when men claiming to be substitute teachers attempted to kidnap her during her lunch break, but she had been warned to expect trouble and managed to escape while federal agents arrested the would-be kidnappers. Sarah was living under federal protection, but she insisted on returning to the Victorian house in Portland where she had found the original photograph, because she believed there might be additional evidence hidden in the walls, and she was determined to find it before the criminals could destroy it. What Sarah found exceeded her wildest expectations. The house had been owned by Arthur Brennan, the photographer, who had used it as a safe house where he stored evidence related to the Henderson case and dozens of other families who had been murdered or disappeared by the same criminal organization over the course of 50 years. Hidden throughout the house were photographs, documents, audio recordings, and physical evidence that proved the existence of a network involving organized crime figures, corrupt politicians, judges, police officers, and social workers who had been operating in the Pacific Northwest since the 1960s. The evidence showed that the Henderson family was just one of many families who had been targeted for elimination when they stumbled onto information about money laundering, human trafficking, political corruption, and other criminal activities that reached into the highest levels of government. But the most shocking revelation was that Margaret Connor had not just been a victim of the conspiracy. She had been working as an undercover informant for federal agents since the early 1980s, using her false identity to gather evidence against the people who had destroyed her original family. Sarah realized that her entire life had been part of an elaborate federal investigation spanning multiple decades, and that her adoption by Margaret had been orchestrated by law enforcement agents who needed a way to keep the Henderson children safe while building a case against their parents' killers. The criminal trial that followed became one of the largest organized crime prosecutions in Pacific Northwest history, with more than 40 defendants, including former judges, police chiefs, politicians, and business leaders who had been part of the money laundering and murder conspiracy. Sarah, Jason, and Amanda testified about their memories of their childhood and the night their family was attacked. Their testimony was supported by thousands of pages of documents, photographs, and audio recordings that had been hidden in the Victorian house for 50 years. The trial revealed that David Henderson had discovered evidence of a conspiracy involving millions of dollars in illegal funds that were being laundered through legitimate businesses and political campaigns, and that his murder had been ordered to prevent him from exposing the entire network. Margaret testified about her decades-long investigation and her work with federal agents to gather evidence against the conspiracy. She had sacrificed her relationship with her children and lived under a false identity for 50 years in order to bring justice for her murdered husband. The defendants were convicted on charges including murder, racketeering, money laundering, political corruption and human trafficking, with sentences ranging from 20 years to life in prison. But several key figures had died during the 50-year investigation, which meant some aspects of the conspiracy would never be fully resolved. Sarah, Jason and Amanda used the publicity from the trial to establish a foundation that helps families affected by organized crime and political corruption. They work with law enforcement agencies to identify similar cases and provide support for victims who have been forced to live under false identities. The Victorian house in Portland was donated to the foundation and converted into a resource center where families can access legal assistance, counseling services and protection from criminal organizations that target people who threaten their operations. Sarah kept the original family photograph but had it enlarged and displayed in the foundation headquarters alongside photographs of other families who had been destroyed by the same criminal network. It serves as a reminder that justice sometimes takes decades, but it can eventually prevail over even the most powerful conspiracies. Today Sarah works as a federal consultant helping law enforcement agencies identify cases involving organized crime and corruption. She uses her experience living under a false identity to understand how criminal organizations manipulate official records and hide their activities. The photograph that started everything continues to reveal new secrets as advances in digital analysis have uncovered hidden details that were not visible in 1973, including faces of other conspiracy members who were present during the Henderson family final portrait session.